Welcome to our friends from Harvard Business School, from Chicago Booth, and from Michigan Ross. My name is Steve Schomberger. I'm the programming chair for Harvard Business School. And this is the first of our collaborative three-part series on cannabis. Tonight's meeting will be followed over the coming weeks by two others, which Nicole Yelsley from Chicago Booth will be talking about when I'm done with questions with our representative, Illinois State Representative Bob Morgan, and questions from the audience. During the time that I'm talking to Bob, please feel free to use the chat or Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to type in questions. I'll be talking to Bob for probably 30 to 40 minutes. And then I'm going to be turning it over to Nicole, who'll be taking questions from the audience and queries over the coming 30 minutes. Bob, are you there?
I'm here.
Well, first and foremost, happy birthday. Your birthday was yesterday. I'm not going to say how
It was.
you were, but anytime we have a participant whose birthday was, happy birthday. So
Thank you.
Bob Morgan, who's on the screen with me, his background is he is a state representative in the 58th District of Illinois, which happens to be my district. He is a healthcare regulatory and policy attorney at Benesch Law with extensive experience in the still developing cannabis industry. As the first statewide project coordinator for the State of Illinois Medical Cannabis Pilot Program, Bob was appointed by the Governor of Illinois to develop and implement a regulatory framework for the use of cannabis by appointee. Basically, Bob wrote the legislation for cannabis. And I have about 50 questions, which I can probably get only to half of them. But why don't we start with basic question. How did you even get involved in the medical cannabis program to begin with?
Yeah, great question. And Steve, thanks for having me. Thanks to Michigan Ross and to Booth and just having me to join with all of you to talk about the important changes that are happening in society relative to cannabis. And apologies in advance in the event that a 2.5-year-old or 5-year-old comes barging in. But I became involved in this industry. I was a regulator, so my background, again, as Steve mentioned, is in healthcare. I've been a healthcare lawyer my whole career since law school, and I was working in the state of Illinois in the governor's office as, at that time, Governor Quinn's healthcare lawyer. I was helping with things like Affordable Care Act implementation and expansion of Medicaid and the legal issues that came from that. One day I was walking down the hall, and I was stopped by a senior aide to the governor who asked me, what do I know about medical marijuana? And I responded, nothing. And he said, great, here's a binder, read through it. Come to a meeting in an hour. And it was a binder.
What year was it? What year was
this? 2012.
Okay.
And so this was almost 8 years ago now. I had no background in any of this. And I read through the binder. I went to a meeting. And an hour later, I was introduced as the governor's policy advisor for medical marijuana. And that was literally the beginning of it all. And I've been involved with drafting of legislation, implementation of the program, and the cannabis industry from a regulatory perspective ever since.
So a number of states, I believe 10, implemented some type of cannabis legislation before Illinois. Was there one particular state that Illinois used as a roadmap? Did it take bits and pieces from all other 10 states? What were the best practices that were utilized and from which states?
Well, and remember back in 2012, that was medical cannabis. So we had a lot of predecessors before us. The first state that went medical was California. A number of states after that. We were the 21st state in 2014 when our law became effective, after we passed the law in 2013. And we used the best practices of states that came before us. Illinois' medical program was largely based on Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Arizona. Those were some of the most recent medical cannabis states, and it was not an accident that none of them looked like Colorado or California or Michigan. They're very, very regulated, a lot more like gaming and banking than they were like a barbershop or any other retail store. It was very, very heavily regulated, and that was on purpose. And so we took some of the best practices of other states, and then we crafted a law based on what it took to pass in the legislature. So there are things in there that are unlike any other state, in part because that's what it took to pass the law here.
So let's talk about the legislature, because I believe Illinois was the first state, I'm not sure if it's the only state, but at least it was the first state to have legislation passed by the legislature as opposed to a statewide referendum. Why was it the legislature in Illinois as opposed to a statewide referendum, which every other state beforehand had done, to the best of my knowledge?
Yeah, so that's the adult use part of this whole program now. We're talking about adult use recreational cannabis. Anybody without a medical condition who's over the age of 21 can buy cannabis in Illinois legally. We were the first state to pass that through legislation. We don't have a ballot initiative in Illinois the way that you can have a referendum or ballot initiative where public opinion through an election can just literally change the law. It's one of the reasons it's a lot more populist, direct populist, if you can just change the laws based on popular vote. And it can also lead to problems. For example, when Colorado and Washington State were the first states to have recreational, they did it through a ballot initiative. The good news for them is they were the first to do it in 2012, and it became effective in 2014. The downside for them is when you pass a law based on the public drafting it and voting on it, you lose a lot of nuance. You lose the ability to regulate the same way you would otherwise want. And so Colorado and Washington have and continue to struggle in a lot of ways because it wasn't as flushed out and negotiated and debated in the public before the public just voted yes or no on language that someone in the public wrote. Illinois doesn't have that process. The only way you can make a law in Illinois is by changing the state constitution. And in fact, in Illinois, this November, we'll be voting on a referendum to change the state constitution dealing with income tax. But it's incredibly rare. It will be the second time that we have ever voted on a change to the state constitution since the Illinois state constitution in 1970. So it's been a while. So we have to go through legislation. It's one of the reasons why no other state has done it. It's really hard. Legislating, negotiating, politics, it's messy. It's not easy. It's very easy to derail major legislation. In fact, if you have a major bill, whether it's cannabis or casinos or environmental issues, it's more likely to fail than it is to pass. And it takes a long time. And so Illinois, we had to pass it through the legislature. And we were the first to pass. Vermont had passed a very, very small cannabis legalization through their legislature, but they're still implementing it. We passed it in a large scale, a full robust program through the legislature, and it was tough. It was really tough. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Let's talk about that. To what extent was it bipartisan? To what extent was it partisan? Who were the stakeholders for? Who were the stakeholders against? Was there behind the scenes backroom dealing in a smoke-filled room? I mean, how did it actually get to passage?
It was all of those things. It was bipartisan. It was a very strong commitment from Governor Pritzker and the legislative leaders in the House and the Senate who are running the law, running the legislation. Kelly Cassidy in the House, Heather Staines in the Senate, and several others like myself who were involved with it from the very beginning. We were very committed to it being a bipartisan bill. That's added complexity. It makes it harder. In Illinois, obviously, we have a supermajority of Democrats in the House and the Senate. So sometimes just Democrats vote on something and all the Republicans oppose it. So the numbers are there, but it's harder. And for big systems, for big programs like this, you almost always want to have, and almost always do have, bipartisanship. There are political reasons for that. It's pragmatic reasons. We had Democrats who voted against this legislation. So we ended up, I believe, with 66 votes in the House out of 118. We needed 60 votes to pass. And we had Republican votes. We had a Republican leader in the House and a Republican leader in the Senate that was part of all of our negotiations from the very beginning. There were a lot of different challenges to passing this law. It was a roller coaster. Kelly Cassidy and Heather Staines started to have a public debate about this at least 2 years before we passed the bill. So it took a couple of years for everyone to really flush out, what is this program going to look like? What are the safeguards? How are we going to make it bipartisan? How are we going to make it progressive? What are the things we're going to do about criminal justice reform in this bill? And all of those pieces were constantly churning, constantly being tweaked, and every little change impacted something else on the bipartisan score.
So I want to get to all those issues, but before I do, talk about was there statewide polling? Was there a trend from 60% against many years ago to 60% for? I mean, to what extent did public opinion drive this process?
Well, it all starts and it's all derived from the medical cannabis program. So back when I started the medical program, working on it in 2012, public support for it was maybe 50-50, maybe, from medical. Today, 89% of the state supports medical cannabis, 89%. So it's literally the most popular thing you could possibly poll. It's more popular than apple pie. It's popular. And that's medical cannabis. So it took a couple years, and one of the big game changers there, many of you may have seen CNN Sanjay Gupta did a special on Charlotte's Web.
Sanjay, Michigan.
What's that?
He's a University of Michigan grad. Shout out to the Michigan grads.
There you have it. There you have it.
Hello.
So it was a special. It was 2013, and it showed a girl who was having hundreds of seizures a day, who used medical cannabis, who went to 0 seizures a day. And it immediately transformed the way that the public thought about medical cannabis. Recreational took a little bit longer, certainly in Illinois. But to your point about public polling, it was roughly in, I think statewide in the 60s, the mid 60s in terms of public support. The collar counties were over 75%. There's only one demographic of all demographics that were polled that was less than 50% support for recreational cannabis. What's that?
Older people?
No, actually, it was evangelical Christians, self-identified evangelical Christians, and they supported it by 49%. So again, the polling suggested strong public support for this, and in fact, it really outpaced the political support by politicians who tend to be risk averse, many of whom were tough on the war on drugs and big tough on crime elected officials, and it was not easy.
So you touched on a number of items which I want to backtrack on. You touched on health, safety, education. I want to throw in revenue. I want to throw in jobs. I'm probably missing some others, but why don't we touch on at least those 5 in no particular order? Why don't we start with health, safety, and education, then go into numbers for employment and revenue, please. Health, safety, and education.
Sure, and I'll actually use my own prerogative. I'll start in a different place, and I'll get to that. But the key factor that allowed this to pass, which I think is the biggest question. Why did it pass here and nowhere else? Why has it failed in New York and New Jersey? Why have we been successful when a lot of other large states have been unsuccessful in the legislature?
Is it your one? Is it Bob Morgan?
No.
Illinois is
it's
only
Steve Schomburg.
Bob Morgan.
Steve's idea to do all of this. But the biggest reason is social equity. The number one reason why this passed was social equity. Number 2 reason was bipartisanship. Number 3 was strong support from the governor, and maybe in that order. But the social equity component really made this legislation possible, and would have killed this legislation had we failed to deliver on a lot of the items in the social equity bucket and the priorities of people like me who really wanted to make sure we had a strong expungement process. We wanted to make sure that the new licenses coming out are going to be going to those individuals and employing those individuals disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. That has never happened in the cannabis industry since California started in 1996, and certainly since mid-2000s and late 2000s when you started to get more regulated and more limited in licenses. People that own these licenses are generally people that look like me, white men. And so we were trying to and continue to try to push back against that and flip that narrative and flip that historical result. Moving on to the health and safety.
Let's touch on social equity for a minute.
Sure.
In terms of how many growers, how many dispensaries, who chose who the growers are, who chose the dispensaries, how many people from ethnicities, from region, from color, from not color, who determined that? Who was the decision-making body? Because that, I was going to get to that anyhow, but might as well drill into that now. That's a huge question. And who played God, for better or for worse, in terms of allowing people, and how many people were let in the gate, how many people were on the sidelines still pounding in?
Yeah, so I was playing God on a lot of that back when I developed the medical program. So, historical, you mentioned this. So my job after the law passed was to become the director and the program director to implement this program from the state executive branch side under the governor. So we had a couple things set in law. Again, going back to the negotiation point in 2013, it was negotiated how many licenses there were going to be. Some people wanted unlimited, some people wanted one, and we literally were negotiating between those and went back and forth. We ended up with roughly 60 retail stores, the dispensaries, where you can buy it, separate licenses, and then another 22, ended up being 21 grow license cultivators.
So those the numbers now, was there a figure determined? Are those numbers going to grow in the future, or are those set in stone for how long are they set in stone for, if at all?
That was locked in stone from 2013 until still through today. So the businesses that you have out there that are growing and selling and distributing medical and now adult use cannabis are all legacy medical cannabis businesses for a variety of reasons. And there are good and not so good reasons for why this had to happen this way. The not so good is that you just wanted to get it off the ground. A timing question. We wanted revenue coming in. We wanted the product out there. The legitimate policy reason is the people that are growing and selling cannabis today are people who have been doing it since 2015, the initial medical cannabis businesses. And that's a good quality, safety, security argument. It's not good. And again, it's a bad problem with regards to social equity. So when I set up this process, I had probably 50 state employees that helped me review. We ended up with about 350 applications for these 80 licenses. So when we got these applications for 21 growers, we had 150 applications and roughly 215, if I'm doing my math right, dispensary applications for 60 stores.
Do you have a
process
in terms of ethnicity? How many of them are white men who look like you? No, white, black, Hispanic.
It definitely lacked diversity at the beginning. So we had, when I created the process for applications, we were the first state, on a bright side, turn a frown upside down, we were the first state in the country to require, give bonus points specifically for minority-owned businesses. It was not enough points. It was also a very, very expensive process. It was very expensive to apply, very expensive to be successful. You had to have a lot of cash on hand. So we had these two tensions of, it was very hard to apply, and we tried to encourage minority applicants. We ended up with a few African-American owned businesses on the dispensary side, a few women-owned businesses on the cultivation side, but it was a very, very small fraction. It was not reflective of the racial, geographic, gender disparity and differences in ratios of the state. So in that sense, that's a failure. That was not what we set out to do. We created a system we thought it was the best at that point that had been set up, and it didn't result in what we wanted. So today, literally today, the same people that had those medical licenses are the people that are running these businesses throughout the state. There are very, very few that have significant minority ownership. The new licenses, which is really, again, the positive side of all of this, of these new 75 licenses that will be awarded, we had thousands of people and businesses that thousands of applications, about 800 businesses that applied for these 75 new licenses.
And are you still playing God? Are you still playing God, or is somebody else not playing God?
No, I'm not playing God. As my role as a legislator, I write the laws, I don't enforce them. And so there's a new cannabis czar. She's amazing, Toy Hutchinson, former state senator. This is the pot czar for the state. And much like my job, she's overseeing state agencies that are doing this work. And they're hiring people as they can, and they're going through these applications right now from January. So any day now, days, weeks, months, you're going to have an announcement of 75 new retail stores, these dispensaries, that are going to be social equity focused businesses. It's not going to be perfect. You're still going to have white-owned businesses for a variety of reasons, but there will be significant percentages and significant involvement of social equity applicants and minority-owned businesses that I think is going to be a lot to be proud of.
Okay, so a lot's been done. A lot's going with the new pot czar. Is that Tori's title, pot czar?
Toy,
yep. Sure, this is being recorded. I want to make sure we heard right for posterity.
I think she has a lot of nicknames. I call her a friend. So,
Tori. So safety issues, health issues, education. I mean, to what extent were these major concerns? What extent were they non-major concerns? I mean, safety and health, I think, probably were discussed. To what extent were they discussed, and what was resolved, if anything, during the discussions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 600-page bill. So it is a very big piece of legislation that underwent, I couldn't count how many versions of the law I saw before it was final, at least 50. I mean, it was worked, reworked again. Started as a 120-page bill, became an 800-page bill, went to 400. I mean, really, it took a lot. We discussed every aspect of this. We discussed taxation. We discussed testing, lab testing. How do we make sure this is safe for people? Just because you're not a medical patient doesn't mean you're using recreationally for non-medical reasons. There are a lot of people that have compromised immune systems. We want to make sure this is safe. We want to make sure the facilities knew what they were doing. They're growing safe product. They have facilities that are safe, making sure you don't have diversion, making sure they're hiring people that can do their job. All that's in the law. There's a lot of lab testing requirements. There's product labeling and testing. There's inventory control provisions. There's language in there that talks about where you can advertise. You can go on and on and on. This is a very heavily regulated and heavily negotiated bill. And we talked about all of it. Law enforcement was involved. I think it's an interesting aspect to talk about. For one, when we passed medical cannabis, law enforcement was opposed. They were opposed. They said, kids are going to get medical cannabis and get high. It's going to be sold outside of schools. It's going to get people sick. It's not going to work. It's going to just get a whole bunch of people arrested and commit criminal acts. They're going to have a lot of drug driving. And literally none of that happened under the medical program. So when it came time for recreational, it was a funny shift because the law enforcement folks, same ones who yelled at me back in 2013 and 14 for how bad this was, were the ones that came and testified and said, well, we support medical. Medical's great. We're really a big fan of medical. But the recreational, well, that's different. That's going to hurt people. People are going to get addicted. People are going to commit crimes. People are going to be lazy. You go on and on and on. And law enforcement was involved, I think, to their credit, to make it a better bill. We dealt a lot with drugged driving. You know, you talk about health and safety, and law enforcement's in that bucket too, because there are real concerns. Because this is a substance that we're talking about. And it has addictive properties. It's much lower than alcohol and tobacco, but that doesn't mean it has none and no addictive properties. So those were things we discussed, debated, negotiated to get to the final bill.
So quality control, I don't know if you touched on that or something I was thinking about while you were talking about this, but who controls the quality to make sure it's all the same level as opposed to all over the place? Is there...
Well, yeah, every batch has to be lab tested. So every crop, a batch of a couple dozen plants in the same growing area, they will take samples from those areas, from those plants, and they'll send it off to an independent lab to test it for chemicals and heavy metals. They'll test it for the THC and CBD and other chemical composition of what this product really is. And then quality control, some of it is physical in terms of you can see the flower that's really, really well done. Once you start to deal with infusing and processing and you extract oils from the products, there's a lot of chemistry involved. There's a lot of quality control within all of that. Packaging is, again, a major element to make sure it's clearly labeled and you know what you're buying within a very, very small window of variation and variable. So all that's really heavily regulated.
So let's talk about the economic impact. I know we're getting back to some of these. I'm sure there's questions. I see questions throwing on the screen about what we've been talking about, but I'll have a whole laundry list of questions. So economic impact, we have jobs, we have tax revenue. You talked about the revenue, you talked about the taxation a little bit. I think we have 3, maybe 4, but at least 3 different types of taxes. Why don't we talk about what we expected for jobs, where they are now, especially in this environment. We expected for revenue, where we are now, and where we expect jobs and revenue to be in the future. So looking backwards, current, and looking forwards, please, on jobs and revenue.
Jobs is definitely a motivation for some people that were involved in this legislation. It's creating a new industry. So on its face, you're taking sales from an illicit industry that is not, you're not paying taxes for, it's not creating jobs that are tax-paying jobs. You are taking the illicit market and you're trying to put it into a regulated industry. So there were clearly going to be jobs, and there have been. So Illinois already has thousands of jobs for the existing licenses. The new licenses will bring thousands more, and the industry will continue to grow. So in the past, I mean, the economics of that was certainly something we negotiated and talked about. Taxation is an element of that. There are some big picture economics questions. In other words, when you legalized alcohol, when we did away with prohibition, most states messed up. And what they did was they taxed the crap out of it. And excessive taxation, and it did not encourage the illicit market to come in to the legal market. Washington State is an anomaly there. Back in the 30s, it was one of the few states that actually did it right, because they kept taxation as low as they could to encourage people to participate in the legal market. That was always in our mind. We were always trying to keep the tax low. I would say, I think it's fair to say the sponsors of legislation would all agree we ended up with probably a notch above what we had hoped for with taxation. And one of the reasons is because you layered in a lot of different taxes. We ended up layering a county and a local tax. The product itself is already expensive. And then there's a layered taxation, to your point, depending on what the product is. Flower, and then if you get to a higher THC, it's more expensive. When you go to infused product, it's more expensive. So all of that goes into the economics of somebody. If you have the choice between paying $16 for cannabis or $18 for cannabis, and $18 means you're legal, and $16 means you're buying on a street corner, a lot of people are going to go with the $18. Not everybody. That's a funny thing about economics. But if you go from $16 to $25, you lose a significant portion of people that would otherwise try and be in the regulated market. But that's a big price difference. And so we are mindful of that. And we are slowly, and it will take a couple years for us to balance out the cost of everything for the economics. And then also the taxation is the money that comes back to the state. So we want more money for the general revenue fund in Illinois while we're struggling. We want more money for substance abuse education, more money for social equity applicants and grants in our communities. Every dollar you tax on to the cannabis product is a dollar that moves people away from, or maybe towards, the illicit market. And so those are all things we talked extensively about. It's too soon at all to know what the real impact is on that. We're only 6 months or 5 months into the legal market in Illinois. But we extensively discussed all those things, surely messed it up, because the legislatures more likely than not are going to mess something like this up. But the point is we can go back and we can work it and try and make it better.
So the revenue projections, I've seen some articles in the past couple of weeks that revenue projections are well ahead of schedule. What were the original revenue projections? What are they now? And where do you see the revenue in the future?
So the rough estimate of a fully developed, fully mature recreational market in Illinois should generate somewhere between $350 and $700 million in tax revenue a year. Remember, the tax revenue varies anywhere from 20%, 15% up to 35, 36%. So it's a big range. But then, so you have to multiply roughly by 4 or 5 times that to get the real sense of the scale of the gross revenue of the industry. And that's jobs, and that's tax payments, that's new business and business growth and development and communities that probably need it. So those were the estimates. We're still really, really early. I mean, again, being 5 months into it and not being fully developed, and a slow rollout at the time of COVID-19. So right now, I think you're going to put me on the spot with some math. I think we're on target for about 100 million in this next fiscal year for recreational cannabis sales, again, with a fully developed market of 350 to 700. So I think we're about on pace of where we thought we'd be around this time. It's going to take a couple years to build that out. But the sales and, the contradiction of how we're all shut down, but cannabis businesses are essential businesses, which for a variety of reasons I'm grateful for. So they're all open.
How's cannabis doing now in the state of coronavirus? Is cannabis booming?
It's doing really well. It's doing really well. There are new challenges there that we didn't expect or have. Social distancing in lines is difficult. Making sure medical patients are prioritized, which we had from the original bill, makes it more difficult in some ways if you have increased demand and reduced supply, because it's still early days in a probably a 5 to 10-fold increase in demand from where we were just 6 months ago. Those are economics that are difficult to manage and micromanage by the state.
So I have two more questions. One, I want to look back to something you just said. I want to wrap up on a global level, talking about the federal cannabis. And then I'm going to turn over to Nicole. But looking at the numbers now between what's regulated and on the street, do you have a sense that 80% are going the regulated route and 20% are going the street route, or is it 100%? It's not going to be 100% zero, but what percent is going the regulated route? What percent is still going the street route? Do you have a sense of that, or is it still too early to tell?
It's incredibly early to tell. Just raw numbers, the illicit cannabis market is roughly $50 billion in the United States. So 50 billion. The regulated legal medical and recreational cannabis market in the United States collectively, I think, is about 2 to 3 billion right now. No, I'm sorry. Those numbers are higher. It's now, I think, 8 or 9 billion. So it's rising collectively between medical and recreational. But there's still a big gap there. And it's not apples to apples, and it's really hard to it's a pure estimate of a sample of people, because you're not reporting illicit market sales. But we have a long way to go. There are a lot of things the state does to entice people to come into the legal market, in the sense of making it accessible is a big deal, making sure it's safe and you know exactly what you're buying. That's a big deal, but still much more expensive at this moment than the illicit market.
So let's talk about, I've lost track of how many states have actually passed any type of cannabis legislation. Is it 33?
33 states have medical or adult use legalization. So
we've got this inherent conflict between the federal, it's illegal. 33 states have passed it in some way, shape, or form. Do we see a roadmap to the U.S., just like gay marriage, as an example, getting on the train and passing national cannabis legislation, so the national banks can now finance cannabis legislation, which they're not allowed to do? I mean, to what extent do we see this train leaving the station and taking up speed on a national level? Are we anywhere close? Are we still far away? And if so, how far away are we? And what's going to take place to actually cross that threshold on a national basis?
That's a great question. There are a number of people that are involved in marriage equality nationally. They're involved with cannabis legalization nationally. So there are a lot of people that see direct parallels here. I would argue that they are different. And I think the difference is cannabis legalization in some states is now more popular than marriage equality. And I think that the cultural divide on cannabis will change quicker than marriage equality. I don't think every state, given the option, will legalize. I don't know that Utah will ever legalize cannabis, even when they can. I used to say Mississippi. Mississippi was always my joke line. Like, when Mississippi goes medical cannabis, then everyone's going. Mississippi literally has a ballot initiative in November, and they're probably going to legalize medical cannabis in Mississippi, right? To give you a sense of where we're headed. I still think we're a few years off at the federal level. And again, I would go back to an earlier story I told about the state legislature, where a regular recreational cannabis legalization was hugely popular. 66% that's pretty good. You vote on an issue and you see 66% statewide, let alone collar counties in Chicago. When you have that kind of percentage, and to your point, 33 states already have medical and recreational. The difference is the U.S. Senate is a lot older and a lot more conservative than most of their states. And I think it's going to take a few years. A new president at this point, Joe Biden, same president, Donald Trump, neither of whom are really excited about legalization of cannabis, frankly. I think it's going to be a couple more years. I do think it's coming. It's inevitable. I think there are a lot of questions about how that happens, whether we treat it like a pharmaceutical drug or we just treat it like health supplements and over the counter. Those are big differences.
Could you treat it like alcohol? Would alcohol be?
Treat it like alcohol.
Yeah.
Those are big questions. What does that mean between cannabis and hemp? As hemp is now federally legal, thanks to Mitch McConnell and other former tobacco states. There's a lot of questions about where we head from here. What happens to the market for all these businesses? All that's going to be impacted by changes at the federal level.
Okay. So Nicole, I'm assuming there's quite a few questions. So I'm going to turn over to my co-host, Nicole Yelsley from Chicago Booth. I'm going to thank Bob very much. And Nicole's going to take over the remaining 20 minutes to ask you questions from the audience and tell everybody once again about the two remaining parts of the cannabis three-part series we have coming up. So Bob, thank you very much for me. Nicole, it's all yours. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess one of the first questions, and feel free to continue to send them in from the audience too. One of the first questions is kind of a direct follow-up to what you were just talking about, and that is, which state in the Midwest do you think will follow suit next and why?
Excellent question. So Michigan has already legalized as well through ballot initiative. They are recreational and they're active as of December of this year. So they beat us by about a month, but their rollout is a lot slower than ours. In terms of the Midwest, the only other one that I could see going recreational anytime soon would be Ohio. And there, you're still probably a couple years off. The Midwest is a funny thing. It's very conservative on a lot of issues. Certainly, you can look at the way that they've been handling reproductive health, the way that Illinois is kind of an island. We have now Democratic governors in Michigan and Wisconsin. That's changing the culture and the politics a little bit, but not drastically. So I think it's going to be a while. I think the next states that will go recreational will be Northeast states. But there are a couple ballot initiatives that are also possible that will be really interesting because who the heck knows what November is going to look like.
Definitely. Are states working together? This is my own follow-up question. Are states working together on these pieces? I mean, obviously from a federal level, yes, but I guess what are states doing to learn from each other?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question from my perspective. When I started managing this program in Illinois for medical, there was no consortium or dialogue or email addresses or chats or phone calls with other state directors. So I created a listserv of every program director in the country, and we just started sharing best practices. At that point, that included recreational states like Washington and Colorado. And now all the state directors talk a lot. There are national conferences of state regulators on cannabis. It's much easier to track what other states are doing as there are more and more, critical mass of states. And so there's a lot of discussion at the state level with these regulators. And there's just a lot of commonality. Even if the state might be really different, the regulatory problem is similar. How do you get access to banking? How do you make sure your lab tests are accurate and they're not being exploited? Pay for service, right? The more you pay, the better your lab test results are going to be. How do you avoid that? You can go down the list, and every state regulator deals with similar stuff.
Going on the banking topic, another question that came in: what legislation, if any, has been enacted to address the banking regulation at the state versus the federal level to support the cannabis business?
Yeah, and for anyone who's been tracking this industry at all, banking is a huge problem. It is a problem for historic reasons. It's a problem for the development of the industry. It is a problem for bringing social equity ownership into the market because we don't have access to traditional loans. So you can't go to Chase and say, I want a $3 million loan to open a cannabis business. They will kick you out. I was the president of we created the Illinois Cannabis Bar Association, so a group of lawyers that do cannabis work. And I was the president of it, so I wanted to open a bank account just so we could have social events. So I go into the bank. I've been with Chase myself forever, and so I go into Chase and say, I want to open a bank account. Oh, great. What's it for? Oh, it's a nonprofit that we're setting up, and it's just going to be focused on just education and just social events. And, oh, what's it called? The Illinois Cannabis Business Bar Association. One moment, sir. And he walks away and he calls somebody. Somebody comes down and he says, sir, can't open anything that has cannabis in it. And again, this is a group of lawyers. All they were doing was just having social events, not cannabis social, just going to bars. So anyway, banking is a major obstacle. There is federal legislation to address that. It has a chance of passed the House. It's called the SAFE Act. It would significantly increase access to banking. States have tried to deal with this on a one-off and largely have failed. Illinois had a couple bills to address it. The Illinois Treasurer and the Department of Revenue have been working on this issue for years. California tried to literally create a state bank just for this purpose. And California, the 8th biggest economy in the entire world, could not figure out financially how to set up its own bank. It was too expensive. They didn't have enough money. It would have cost billions of dollars to set up a bank. And it just functionally wasn't going to work. So we need to fix that again. From my perspective, the biggest reason is because it's keeping people from the industry that we really want to encourage to have an opportunity to succeed. And just those that are getting private access to private capital of millions of dollars right now is the only real way. And that's not a good long-term strategy. Definitely.
So it sounds like one of the barriers is just the stigma that goes, like historical stigma that goes around with it. Is there any stigmas that you think need to be overcome in particular, especially with legislatures, bankers, that sort of thing, that we need to focus on overcoming a certain stigma?
So the stigma, it's an interesting question because I don't think the stigma largely in most places in the country are, it's stigmatized because it's cannabis. I think it's stigmatized because it's illegal. So it's an important distinction. It's not that you'll walk into a bank and they'll say, oh, it's cannabis. You guys are just getting high all the time. It's not that. It's we have a compliance program and we are a bank that by definition is limiting risk. It's what we do. We are structured in every way to reduce and limit and mitigate risk. And you're coming in here with a business on its face that will always be risky until they change the federal law. So it's a compliance question. So the stigma is the illegality and not so much the cultural stigma of it. But it is a real problem. It's not just banks, it's insurance companies, it is property managers, it is traditional investors. While there are stories that I've heard of venture capital where they won't invest because of the cultural stigma, it's much more so, I think, the illegality stigma that comes with it.
Makes sense. And you talked about working with the cops and kind of their hesitation. What was the violence interruption plan when this rolled out, and particularly in the equity zones that you talked about?
I'm sorry, Nicole, can you repeat the question?
The violence interruption strategy. So what was that plan as you're rolling this out this year, and particularly in the equity zones that you talked about?
Violence plan, interruption plan. It wasn't violence. So the aspects of law enforcement involved with the social equity was much more with expungement and clemency of those that had previously been convicted or had a criminal history. There's still an element, and it continues to be a major problem, of intoxication, driving while intoxicated with cannabis, because we don't have a .08, nor do we have technology to even enforce that if we did have any kind of standardization. So there's no per se limit. Illinois actually has a per se limit, but we literally made it up. We made up the per se limit. It's not based on 50, 60 years of driving while intoxicated with alcohol that we know. .08 is the average. And yet we all know somebody who's 90 or 100 pounds who drinks one beer and can't drive. And we also know people who drink 12 packs and are just fine, because the body absorbs alcohol differently. Same with cannabis. Some people that are regular users are not necessarily impaired, even if they're using quite a bit. So we don't have that standardization. So from law enforcement side, that's a big issue. They continue to be, and I think legitimately focused on the fact that we're building the plane as we're in the air, in the sense that we're trying to impose new standards on impaired driving while we've legalized. The counter argument to that is people have been driving high for years. There's no evidence to suggest that more people are driving high in states that have legalized. It's just that we're tracking the information better. So there's not more people going to the ER who are high because they overdose on cannabis and of course aren't dying from cannabis the way they are from other substances. It's just that we're tracking that information better. People are disclosing what's going on more. So law enforcement was really and continues to be concerned with those things. There are medical patients can now grow in their own home. So home grow is a big obstacle and a big opposition from law enforcement. But they're at the table and they will continue to oppose this for years. But I think ultimately with legislation like this, it's better to have them at the table, hear their opinions, and where possible, improve the legislation.
Really makes sense. So besides COVID-19, as you were thinking through all the things that might happen with this rollout, was there anything that surprised you? I mean, obviously so much went into this 600 plus page bill, as you said, and had so many considerations. Is there anything that's happened post rollout that is surprising besides COVID?
we have yet to hear of a story of somebody who, and it doesn't mean it hasn't happened, I just haven't seen the news story of somebody who has had an accident who was high on legal marijuana. I expected that within the first month, and it didn't happen. I spent a lot of time with press and media strategy on all of this and setting lower expectations so people know what to expect. And I thought by now there'd be some negative stories about cannabis consumption and scare tactics. And it sells newspapers, but so far, unless I've missed it, I haven't seen any in Illinois. And I think that's a testament to the relatively slow rollout, but also to the prioritization in law enforcement to protecting people, not just arresting people because they have cannabis on them.
Definitely. Just talking a little bit about the difference between medical and recreational cannabis, and how is it differentiated? Is it based on THC levels, or is there other factors?
So there's a literal slight difference, and then there's the sales tax and the pragmatic difference. I'll start with the pragmatic difference. Medical cannabis is only sold to individuals in Illinois. You can be a child with a guardian and caregiver who can buy it for you under certain circumstances. So medical, you have to have an underlying medical condition. Historically, that's been very, very limited in Illinois compared to other states. Right now, we have just over 100,000 medical cannabis patients in Illinois out of a state of 13 million people. It's a pretty low percentage relatively to a lot of states compared to a lot of states. And the difference right now, a lot of dispensaries, because there's limitations on product, we're short on supply in some ways. Medical patients have first in line access and priority access. So some dispensaries will only sell to medical patients 6 days a week and might have 1 or 2 days that are recreational, in part because they just don't have enough product and they have to prioritize medical. Medical cannabis is taxed at 1%. So it's a pharmaceutical tax, but again, compared to recreational, which is taxed anywhere from 15 to about 35%. So it's a significant price difference. The literal difference in terms of the product, it depends. So the common understanding is that CBD, the chemical composition of the cannabis that leads to pain reduction and reduction of nausea, the CBD, the high CBD percentages are supposed to be more medical. Most medical patients want a higher CBD content than THC. That's not always true, depending on the medical condition. I know a lot of patients who have conditions where the THC has to be higher to benefit them. There are psychological disorders that are eligible for medical cannabis, PTSD. There's a lot of research that suggests it needs to be a little bit higher THC to really benefit them the way that they need to. So it's discussed as a linear thing, but it's not. And so the product difference tends to be higher for CBD for medical patients. And the products are really, there's a lot more infused products now for medical, a lot more oils and cookies and gummies and chocolates, whereas adult use tends to be a higher percentage of flower, smokable cannabis.
This next question is on the plan or timeline on the licenses that are available to entrepreneurs, and if there's any more information or details or where that information could be found.
I'm not going to be able, I don't have any more information than what you already know. So licenses were supposed to be awarded beginning of May due to COVID, was the reason given by the state that COVID delayed the processing of those applications. I don't have any idea whether it's tomorrow or next week or next month. I think that the state will put those licenses and award them as soon as they can. I know that they're working on it. I just don't know on timing.
Lots of uncertainty right now in general. So.
Yes.
I think that wraps up the questions, unless if anyone has any other questions, feel free to submit them here. But otherwise, I think I just leave it with you if there's any kind of final things you wanted to say. And I also did want to say, first of all, thank you so much to Bob for doing this on behalf of Booth and Ross and HBS. Really appreciate it. This is the first in a 3-part series on the new culture of cannabis. So this one obviously focusing on legislation. We have next week on the 3rd. That's about navigating the new landscape with a number of growers on the panel. And then on the 9th, we have Breaking the Stigmas about cannabis and CBD with a couple of entrepreneurs and consultants in the cannabis space. So do you have anything else that you wanted to kind of leave with as well?
I think we asked a lot of the right questions. If you're trying to track where this is all headed, those are the types of questions to be thinking about. You know, when is somebody going to invent the technology that can track impairment, roadside tests? Who's going to fix the banking system and how? When are we going to legalize at the federal level? What does this mean for our communities where, you know, if you really look at it honestly, the people that have really benefited from this are not and have not been those disproportionately impacted by the illegality over the last really 100 years. When we track it back to the US history, you know, so we have not done enough to reinvest in the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by this. That's my motivation. It is hard to do from a government standpoint, and I'm hopeful that when these licenses are awarded, these new 75 dispensaries, and then months later for the craft grow and the infuser licenses and transporters, I'm hopeful that it will reflect the community in the state in terms of its demographics. And stay involved, stay active, and if I can ever be helpful, you know, my information I'm sure will be available. And I really appreciate everyone tuning in.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.